Hello, I'm Nick Maennling from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and I will be answering some of the questions that you guys have posted for this week. So I don't think it's going to be such a long video today because I've only received 4 or 5 questions, but I will take them one at a time and I will answer all of them. So hopefully, I can answer the questions of the people that have posted them. So I'll take them as they came in. The first one being, the resource curse is a major problem, but would a systematic legal and regulatory framework in a country help in avoiding the curse? So this is a very good question, and maybe just to recap what the resource curse is, and maybe just to say it in layman terms, the idea behind the resource curse is that countries that should be doing really well because of all the resources that they have, like oil, gas, and coal, and other minerals, are actually doing or are worse off than those countries with fewer resources. And I would say that there are probably 3 main components to managing these resources well. The first one being a sound macroeconomic management, good planning on the part of the government and this needs to be underpinned by a sound legal framework. So I do believe that the legal framework is a key ingredient in order to address some of the factors of the resource curse. Let's take, for example, one of the often mentioned factors that contribute to the resource curse, which is corruption. So, in many resource-rich countries, there is quite a lot of corruption. And how can we combat this corruption? And there are several laws that can help to try and make it more difficult for those that are corrupt to do their corrupt practices. So, for example, a legal system that requires more transparencies around which licenses are allocated to whom, more transparency of whom owns the companies that are getting the licenses, or more transparency around how much revenues come in from the extractive industry sector. And you may have already addressed this throughout your lectures, but one example where countries put into their regulatory framework these transparency initiatives come originally, there are initiatives such as EITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which tries to bring more transparency to the sector. So governments that sign up to it require the companies to make their revenue payments more transparent, and the government makes public how much they receive, and the companies say how much they pay, and then they try to see if there is a difference, so what accounts for that. And now the new EITI standard has become more stringent. But I've worked in a couple of countries where that initiative has been changed into law and is part of the regulatory framework. Another term that is often associated with the resource curse is Dutch disease, whereby the extractive sector drives up the exchange rate and pulls resources from other parts of the economy, thereby making non-extractable tradable goods less competitive to export them. And here, sound management, how to manage the capital inflows and how the money can be allocated needs to be taken into account. So, part of it, again, is this planning framework. But another part of it, to underpin this, also is our regulations and the legal framework. So many countries have set up, for example, sovereign wealth funds, where they say, okay, when the money comes in from the extractive sector. We don't want to spend it all immediately because that will drive up prices and cause Dutch disease. So, and we also need them in order to better manage volatility. So in such cases, you need clear rules and regulations as to which money goes into these sovereign wealth funds and under what circumstances can people take out that money. So again, that's a mix between planning what to do with the revenues, coming up with a good strategy of what you're going to do with it, and then using the legal and regulatory framework in order to implement or avoid certain political actors to use money for purposes that are not within that strategy. And just to give you an example of a country that I've worked in Timor-Leste, that's a very quite a small country, one of the newest countries in terms of being accepted and viewed as an independent country, and they also have, in their terms, significant oil reserves. In the international scale, quite small, but because it's quite a small country, it's quite a lot. And we supported them in setting up a system of how to manage the resources. So they came up with a plan originally to put the money initially aside, all the money that comes from the extractive industry sector, and invested abroad in order to avoid Dutch disease and mismanagement. And then later, through and they set up the system with clear rules as to what would have to happen in order to change that. And then they amended this slightly to spend some of the revenues domestically first, because they saw that investing abroad in US Treasury bonds, for example, was giving them a lower return than if they would invest it in infrastructure and human capital in the country. So there was a movement towards, spending some of the money that was accruing in the sovereign wealth fund domestically, and so they went through Parliament and came up with a medium to long-term strategy of what they wanted to do with the money, and then set up infrastructure spending fund and a human capital spending fund, with the idea being that all these revenues from the oil should be invested in the economy rather than spent on recurrent spending, such as wages or military spending, for example, was also not included there. So underpinning all this was always, certain rules and regulations in order for, if someone comes into power that wants to change it alone, he can't do that because there is a regulatory framework around it, and institutions that stop him from doing that. So that are two examples of how the legal framework and the regulatory framework can play a very important role in avoiding the resource curse. Okay, so let's move to the second question. So this question reads, how to prevent and preempt the resource curse while contributing to sustainability? Should countries avoid resource for infrastructure deals completely? If not, what are the key items the countries should negotiate for? So as I mentioned before, and there seems to be three questions in one, but I'll focus more on the resource for infrastructure deal part of it, because I think the first question already spoke to a little bit of what I think is crucial in order to avoid the resource curse: good planning, a sound legal regulatory framework that fulfills the goals set out in the planning documents, and institutions that ensure that the legal framework is adhered to. And then, through the sovereign wealth fund, managing some of the volatility of resource revenues in order to avoid the Dutch disease. So resource for infrastructure deals, the way I like to look at them is just another way of monetizing your resources. So the traditional development model is that, you know, you give the concession to a company, the company extracts the oil and the gas and the minerals, and then you receive royalties and taxes in return, which you can then spend in infrastructure, right? Now, the benefit of resource for infrastructure deals is that you can basically monetize the natural resources straight away. So, you know, for many African countries where the infrastructure gap is very large, this is very attractive because you don't have to wait for a certain amount of time before you can build the infrastructure. So just thinking of the concept itself, without going into the nitty-gritty of you know, what some of the benefits are and some of the fallbacks, it seems to be a very good model for governments that require infrastructure investments. And you know, a lot of these resource for infrastructure deals have been signed by Chinese companies, and they're fairly good at building infrastructure. So there seems to be a good mix between countries that require the infrastructure, which has been Africa, and countries that require the resources and are prepared to finance infrastructure upfront, which have been the Chinese. So in terms of the model, I think that's worth keeping in mind. So let's now try and think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of resource for infrastructure deals. And you know, some of them may be the same coin but two sides. I think the first one, as I already mentioned, are the economic complementarities between China and Africa. China wants resources and builds infrastructure. Africa needs infrastructure. Then for some developing countries, it might be a simplified transaction, which delivers infrastructure quickly and cheaply without some of the conditionalities that some other players, like the international donors, would require. And I'll come to the disadvantage. That also has its disadvantages, but just for now, let's focus on the advantages from a developing country perspective. It actually may have the potential to decrease corruption, as money does not necessarily flow through government institutions. So one way that resource for infrastructure deals have, or how they can be structured, is that the deal is signed, and then the infrastructure is built directly by the Chinese, which are paid by the Chinese bank. So it doesn't go through the coffers of the government and then goes out again to the infrastructure providers, which is you know, another potential place for corruption. And another one, and these are, I mean, they might be a lot more, but these are just some of the ones that I've come up with. It has the potential to reduce wasteful spending, right? So generally, it's agreed that spending money in infrastructure is an investment that provides an economic return, whereas spending in other types of expenditures, such as you know, military spending or wages, recurrent expenditure, is less likely to lead to economic growth. So that's another aspect of it, because it locks it into infrastructure spending. So let's move to some of the disadvantages. Lack of precedence and transparency of the deals, and this is, you know, what is often highlighted, that there is not as much experience with these types of deals as with the other model, whereby it's first monetized and then spent. And I previously mentioned the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. A lot of efforts have been spent on, you know, trying to monitor how much money comes in through the budget, how much money goes out. These deals tend to be more obscure, and there are fewer of them. So we don't have that much to go by, whether these are good deals or bad deals. There is often not an international tender process for the infrastructure, which may lead to inflated costs and lower quality. So if these deals are conditional upon, you know, the country that is providing the loan also providing the infrastructure company and selects those, then there is less competition, and that may reduce the quality and increase the costs. Lower tax collection and less flexibility once committed. This is kind of the counter argument for from reducing wasteful spending, because let's say you know, a disaster hits, and you as a government would want to rechannel those revenues that are coming in to other projects. You can't do that now because you have to pay off the loan to the infrastructure, and the infrastructure has already been built. There may be an additional debt burden, which cause fiscal sustainability problems. So this ultimately is also a debt, right? Because often how the deals are structured is that the money is provided up front, and you can build the infrastructure, but obviously the repayment is made through through the ore that is being extracted, be it through revenues or be it through the commodity itself. And that's one way. That's one way of debt, right? So if you do your debt sustainability analysis, you need to include that as a debt. And there may be less linkages to the local economy if you build the infrastructure with conditionalities, as I mentioned before, of the country that provides the deal. You know, there may be certain aspects of them requiring work skills and companies being used from abroad rather than from your own country. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages around resource for infrastructure deals as I see them. And then towards the last question of this, if not, what are the key items that countries should negotiate for? And I really think that, you know, big importance has to be placed on ensuring that the quality of the infrastructure that is built, that you have some sort of control over it, that there are ways to monitor and evaluate that the agreed quality is met. I think that's really the key for countries that are looking to engage in resource for infrastructure deals. So to summarize, I don't think they're necessarily bad deals. I think there are a lot of potential advantages of them. There are, however, a number of pitfalls that should be addressed by countries. Okay, so let's move on to the third question. Resource revenue allows the government to keep taxes levied on citizens low. In terms of empirical example or in theory? Okay, so my understanding of this question is whether there is empirical evidence for countries that are resource rich whether they have lower taxes than non-resource rich countries. And there is ample evidence for it. There are a number of studies that have looked into that, including one recent study by the IMF, which used 35 resource-rich countries, and found that for every dollar of resource revenue received, 30 cents in non-resource tax revenues were lost, which is, I mean, quite a significant amount of money. And it found that particularly value-added taxes in those countries fell. Now, what the theory or the thought is why this might be the case, I think the driving force is that governments are less reliant on domestic tax collection in order to fund their expenditures, right? So if the only revenues that you can collect is from your citizens, then you place a lot more importance on that. Whereas if it comes from elsewhere, then you're less reliant on them. I think an example would be if you win the lottery as an individual, you're also less likely to next day go to work, and you're less reliant on the wages from your daily job. Obviously, if it's a large win on the lottery. But what are the problems of this finding? And I think that's worth spending a couple of minutes on. Obviously, it exacerbates the dependency on the extractive industry sector, right? And as we know, natural resources will not last forever, and they're highly volatile. And I think when you look around the world today, you know, after the commodity price bust, many countries are really struggling to fund their budget. And a lot of them are resource-dependent countries. So, you know, it's a very risky strategy to depend on. And the other types of taxes, like VAT, like income tax, they're far less volatile than taxes from the extractive industry sector. And also, so talking about, you know, that one day the resources run out, it takes a long time to build a reliable tax base and tax compliance. So humans, when they haven't been paying taxes for a long time, then it's very difficult to make them pay taxes from one day to the other. And it also takes a long time for audit capacity to increase, for governments to build up their capacity in order to collect taxes. So if a country runs out of resources, it's not that next day it can replace its lost revenues with suddenly increasing the taxes domestically. That's not how it works. And the last aspect, which feeds into, you know, some of the first and the second question around the resource curse, unless the population pays for taxes, there is less of a motivation for the population to hold governments accountable. So if you pay your daily tax, your monthly tax, and the roads are in a very bad shape, then you're likely to be more annoyed than if you're not paying any taxes. So this accountability question is also something that that feeds into it. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth question. Do extractive companies have the right to sue the community if it disturb operations because the company do not honor its CSR? Okay, so the way I understand the question is whether companies can sue, communities can sue the company if operations don't go forward as planned. So I don't know of any cases where a company has sued a community as such, But there are certainly cases where companies have sued governments for failing to protect the company from community disruptions. And one example is the Obuasi operation of AngloGold Ashanti in Ghana, which was invaded by small-scale miners in January this year. And you know, small-scale miners are often part of the community surrounding large gold mines, especially in that part of the world. And the company asked the government to intervene in order to protect the operations. So the operations were invaded. They had to stop operations. They couldn't move forward. They had to take their staff out. But the government, according to AngloGold Ashanti, did not do enough in order to comply with this request. And so it ultimately registered a case at the International Center of Settlement of Investment Disputes in May of this year because of the government's failure to do so. Another example is from the Santa Ana mining concession in Peru. There, farmers were involved in deadly protests due to fears that the mining concession would throw them off the lands and would pollute their water resources. This was a silver mine in the remote mountains near Lake Titicaca. And then the death of this triggered further protests and violence. And then due to fear of a social breakdown in the region, the Peruvian government canceled the concession, which was owned by Bear Creek, which is a Canadian mining company. And in response, so this was before the mine started operations. And then 18 months ago, Bear Creek lodged a $522 million damage claim against the Peruvian government at the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. So those are two examples of companies suing the government for not interfering or not protecting their interests against the community. But as I said, I don't know of a case where the company has directly sued the community. Okay, so let's go on to the last questions. What are the key risks of integrated spatial planning Michael Stanley described in lecture 3? Any bad examples in the history of what we should try to avoid? So I did not go back to view Michael's presentations, and I hope that you know, the students can go back and check which 3 particular risks he described. But I will try and answer some of the key risks and costs that I see that have to be taken into account when planning for resource corridors. And the first one is that you know, part of a resource corridor is the requirement to share some of the trunk infrastructure or the main infrastructure, which is generally built by mining projects. And this is often not necessarily in the interest of mining companies to share this infrastructure. So there are several reasons for that. One of them is that, you know, particularly with rail infrastructure, when the government asks for mining companies to share that infrastructure with other mining companies or with other types of commodities, then this will require additional capital expenditure, right? Because you need, for example, for passenger rail services, you need investments in rail stations, you need investments in other rolling stock or rail wagons. So there is additional capital expenditure there. There's also additional capital expenditure to increase the capacity, because you're saying, okay, you know, you as a mining company, you can export, let's say, 50 million tons per annum. but we require, we want to have other types of commodities on the railway line, and therefore we need an additional 5 million tons per annum. So the capacity needs to be higher, and that requires additional funding. The third cost is efficiency losses. So, and this is quite a big one for mining companies, because the way that mining companies plan their operations is that the mining project, the railway operation, and then also the shipping, if it goes abroad and uses port infrastructure, it needs to be planned as one, right? Because if one link fails or is not efficient, then the whole mining company will not be making money. It doesn't matter where the bottleneck is, it affects everything. So they tend to plan exactly to, you know, extract the ore at a certain pace that makes sure that a certain amount of trains are loaded at a certain time, and they only have sufficient trains in order to get the ore to the port, where it then is transported on the ship, which will arrive exactly when enough ore is at the port, etc. So it's kind of a rolling operation. Now imagine you put on a passenger train, for example, which stops at several intervals, whereas generally cargo trains, mining trains, they go at a continuous speed until, you know, the end. They have no reason to stop in between. Or so there is already an efficiency loss. You have to plan for that. The more actors you have on it, the more difficult it becomes. You need passing loops, and these passing loops, you need to make sure that the trains come at the right time. If there is a delay by the passenger train, the ore train might be delayed, etc. So there are significant potential efficiency losses, which mining companies do not like. You also, in many cases, have to subsidize less profitable services, and this is especially the case in developing countries, where passenger services, for example, cannot pay the full cost to repay the infrastructure investment in the first hand and the operating costs. So there needs to be some system of cross-subsidization, and mining companies might be wary that this will fall on them to pay. And then the last one, which is a very important one, is access to finance. So the banks tend to also prefer infrastructure corridors that are particularly rail projects, where they know how it's being repaid. They are interested that they get their money back, right? And when you have, you know, to go back to my original example, 50 million tons per annum going down the railway, being shipped abroad, and the mining company can get its money from that, and with that repay the loan, then it's fairly clear to the financiers, or clearer to the financiers, how they will get their money back. If there are other operators on the railway line that don't have such an international credit rating like some of these big mining companies, or it's unclear, you know, how the extra capacity will be filled, then they are less likely to provide the financing to build that type of infrastructure. So those are some of the risks, or some of the costs that the mining company will take into account. So one of the biggest risks from the government perspective is that requiring shared use on infrastructure projects or these resource corridors may delay negotiations of the project itself. And because in the question, it says any bad examples in history that we should try to avoid. I don't think this one is avoidable, and I think it's you know, from the government's perspective, it's understandable that they're trying to push for a resource corridor. But one project that has been in the news quite often recently is the Simandou project in Guinea, which is the largest untapped iron ore project, and Rio Tinto recently sold out of that, or is looking to get to move out of that. And one big component of this project is the rail corridor, and the idea around it is to build a resource corridor. And you know, the infrastructure project is a lot more expensive in terms of total capital expenditure as compared to the mining project itself. And some, or it could be argued that, you know, that this project, if it weren't for the government requiring to go through Guinea rather than the shortest route, and not requiring multi-user access to it, maybe that project would have already gone ahead before iron ore prices collapsed. So this is one example where I mean, it's not sure what the real reasons are, but it's one example where the infrastructure may have led to delays in the negotiation. Another risk is that it's very difficult to project future demand on a corridor. So when requiring multi-user access, it's hard to know at what capacity to build it at, right? And this is not only for railway infrastructure, but also for power infrastructure. You know, at what size do you build up these infrastructures? You have to do future demand assessments, but these are obviously not that straightforward. And then also to manage the environmental impacts and stresses can be very complex, because potentially a lot more strain will be placed on a region and surrounding corridors. And I think one thing that Michael also mentioned was the water resources. You know, a lot more stress will be placed on water resources, and with increasing climate change, we're not entirely sure of the impacts on the environmental side. So that's another risk that is difficult to plan for. Okay, so I think those are the questions that were addressed at me. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the course. Thank you. Bye.